land of Canaan, and they came into Haran and dwelt there. So one of the biggest things that a lot of people don't understand in Genesis is when it's giving you this history of the Hebrews or what have you, that they keep harping on, Hebrews, the Hebrew Israelites, Hebrews, Egypt and God's covenant and everything like that. But you're talking about the seed of the Jews comes from Iraq. Think about that. The seed of the Jews comes from Iraq. The seed, the bloodline that would give us Jesus Christ, supposedly, comes from Iraq. So, what does that tell you? So this is one of the things that, when you start to understand about the history of what's been going on with the Palestinians and the people, the Israelites, the people from Israel, is that whole thing. So you would have with the Quran, them understanding that, okay, so we're talking about the Abrahamic faiths originates from, or, where he was deemed to be worthy by God originates from Mesopotamia, Iraq, and has really not too much to do with Israel. So with the land being promised to his offspring, his generations, his seeds, which would eventually, of course, be, stemming from Iraq, this is one of the reasons why you have this biblical or this religious attachment that the Arabs have with Palestine and with that area. But it's a lot more that went to that that's, goes against, that's basically going off of the faith. But this is how they tie themselves into it religiously. But you got to remember, you had the whole war that happened in Israel. And you basically had, I believe it was 1947, the UN step in between Israel and the Arabs, Palestine and Israel going at each other, fighting. And you had them basically separate the land and give, the Jews, Israel, and the Palestinians, Palestine. But the Palestinians, basically, or the Arabs, they couldn't accept that. They wanted all the land. So they basically attacked Israel, and, they had a war. With Israel. Israel won. So when Israel won that war, remember before it's peace. Okay, you got your land, we got our land. Y'all came and attacked us, supposedly. So what Israel did after they won was they basically took more lands from the Palestinians, and then they imposed all these laws and rules and everything on the Palestinians, not letting them live in certain places and not letting them, really govern themselves and be governed by, the Jews. So, they've been rising up. So it's been a war again where they rose up, and you basically had them lose again to Israel, and more land was taken and more freedoms was taken away from the Palestinians. So then you had, again, peace. And it seems like every time a leader arose in Palestine to try to make peace with the Jews, that leader was assassinated by the Palestinians. So they just didn't want peace. And they wanted basically to take all of Israel away from the Jews and to completely eradicate the Jews. But every time they tried, they kept getting beaten. And every time a leader arose to try to make that peace treaty, they did something to the leader. They even killed him or attacked Israel to basically end the peace. So this has been going on for a long time, but it stems from, Genesis. But we also got to remember that this was the purpose for the Holocaust, for them to basically create a race, a nation for Israel, to try to establish them as an actual legit people that is a nationality. And for everybody else, you have heritage, you have history, you have artifacts, you have so many sacred places that we can go to, that we have so much that can back up the history and the nationality of everybody else except for these Jews. The only place you're going to find anything for the Hebrews and the Jews is in the Bible and not in ancient history. Real ancient history, of course, before 400 BCE. So now, when you tie it all together, think about it. You have King James. We're talking about England giving us the King James Version. England giving us that Bible, right? So now, you fast forward. Remember, you will have eventually, and I talked about this in the previous video, about how the Rothschilds, we know, took over the Bank of England. They took the Bank of England. They were smart. They had that bank, and they eventually would rule. So we know it would be the Rothschilds, who basically would put in place the royal family that we know of today. And we understand, remember, Queen Elizabeth, her husband, is what? He is the head of Freemasonry. He is the royal head of Freemasonry. Remember, King James was a Mason. Remember, who did he get to help him with the Bible? He got Francis Bacon, who was considered the father of Freemasonry, to basically help him out, with the Bible. So we have all that connection. We have the Rothschild connection, everything. So remember when they was talking about Hitler and how, where did he get his money from? Remember, Hitler's supposed to have kidnapped Baron Rothschild, let him go, but then took all the money from his bank. That was a cover up because they had to justify where was he getting the funds to fund this war? Who was funding Hitler? Where did the money come from? So we know he stole a lot from the Jews and everything like that, but that takes a lot of time to liquidate. He had to be getting liquid cash from somewhere. So that whole Rothschild scam was to cover up who he was. And the rumors have been out for a while that Hitler was a Rothschild. So you bring it full circle. Remember, what was Hitler's job? To establish Israel as a nation. That was the point of the Holocaust. So it's all coming full circle from the King James Version and its inception all the way up into the establishment of Israel, which we know is running things with Rome today because they are one and the same, plain and simple. So remember, the Greeks, who are white folks, are using the Jews to cover up who they really are, which Jews is Greeks. They're the same people. So after the Holocaust, 1947, as I said, the UN basically, okay, we're going to make you a nation, because they felt like not only should Israel be a nation, but they should be a people. They should be recognized as a people, as a race, as, Hebrews. It's not just a name. But for everybody else, as I said, we can establish that, but not for the Hebrews. We can't establish that at all. But that was one of the purposes for the Holocaust, to try to match up the suffering of the Jews with biblical nonsense, you might as well say. So that happened. And of course, the Arabs, once they took over that land after the Ottoman Empire fell in World War I, you basically had them ever since then, trying to establish this war and get the legitimacy of the Jews and the Hebrews established with the world on a global stage, so everybody could recognize them. So, because we're talking about, remember, you have now how many years? Hundreds of years since we had the King James Version, and them talking about these Hebrews and Jews. If you had the King James Version in the 1600s, you're reading about these Hebrews and Jews. But remember, it's no TVs. You're reading about this stuff in the book. You're not really seeing it as much. And of course, they wanted to spread it as much as possible around the world to get the world familiar and to understand that a such thing as Jews and Hebrews exist. So when you read and you understand about all this conflict with the Jews and Hebrews, and then finally the war happens and you hear the world talking about these names, Jews, Hebrews, or what have you, and them, you had a lot of people like, they fulfilling this biblical prophecy, and they did all that to give relevancy to the Bible. So after the war was over, that's what they did. They established Israel as a nation. People went in there, and it has been conflict ever since because the Palestinians didn't want to give up any part of the land to the Jews. You had Hamas be established and them basically going out and taking over shit. Remember, they basically took Gaza, and you had the wars back and forth with Gaza and Israel so many times. Even still to this day, it's not really safe to be there. And it's been going on for a long time. And every time, as I said, somebody comes along and try to establish a peace, they assassinate that person. So it seems like it's never going to be. They want to keep that conflict going with Israel, with the Arabs, which is supposedly, if you go biblically, is going to lead up to something later on. But the whole point is, how is everybody so wrapped up in this Hebrew thing when the bloodline for Jesus Christ comes from Mesopotamia? What is that? So, and that's something that you got to look at. And then from that, you got to go into the Quran, which we'll do in a couple instances in this series because it's going to bring everything together. And you got to go into the Quran and see how their story goes versus the whole story with the Jews being promised that land. And it's just something, as we've been seeing over the years, the Arabs is not going to allow them to have peacefully. So they continue to fight to this day. So they stuffed a whole lot in Genesis, as you can see. It's 50 chapters in Genesis, and it's a lot that they had to establish right up front. You know, we get the whole thing with the Hebrews in Genesis. We actually get the first name Jehovah is mentioned in Genesis 24:13, I believe it is. And then it's a compound word mentioned in Genesis, but then in Exodus they give you Jehovah, so we get that. So we get the establishment of so many different things. You get towards the end of Genesis, which we're going to get into, is so much information and stories about the Egyptians. And it's one of the things that a lot of people got to understand. If you watch my whole series with the Greek Mythology 1 and everything I've been putting out with Ancient History, Volume 1 and 2, as far as what the Greeks are doing, then you'll get Genesis and what they're trying to do. So when you start getting into Genesis, you go through the whole Abraham bloodline thing with him dying off and giving us his family and everything, you see what they basically doing. Because one of the things you got to ask yourself when you start reading is, how do they know all this stuff about the ancient Egyptians as far as the customs? We're talking about right in the beginning in Genesis. You know, they talking about the Egyptian customs and talking about going into Egypt a lot of times. So, you know, when we read Genesis 41:57 says, and all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all lands. Chapter 39 says, Genesis, and Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Protipater, I should say, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, brought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which had brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptians. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him oversee over his house, and all that he had he put into his hand. Now also when Joseph died, it says he's embalmed and put in a coffin and buried in Egypt. So again, we have never found the body of Joseph in Egypt. Another thing is, we know through Herodotus and through a lot of historians, the Egyptians was not tolerant of anybody's God or anybody's, rules or anything, any cultures or customs that other people was doing. It was all about them in the past, as I talked about. But again, they're giving you this history. When you start going through the end of Genesis and reading it, they're talking about this connection with them and the ancient Egyptians to try to establish that connection. But what are we really talking about here? What does that really fit? When you go back and you go through the Saturn Satan series, when you go through when I was talking about with ancient history, we know what they're trying to give you in the end of Genesis is the connection between them and the Greeks, of course. So when you start to understand what they're talking about and establishing at the end of Genesis is their connection with the Egyptians. This is important to understand. It's them basically saying we're Hebrews, Jews basically being captive with the with the Egyptians, but we really know it's them living in Egypt, being taken care of and taught by the Egyptians, who they basically slandered their name and said, they took us hostage and basically made us slaves, when we know they was in there being taught and being helped with so many different things. This is to establish that connection. We cannot in no way, nowhere, find any proof that any Hebrews were slaves in ancient Kemet. It's bullshit. As I showed you, the glyphs that we see of people in chains and the black people that look like slaves are the Hyksos and the Egyptians themselves. When a Hyksos rule happened, it's them showing the Hyksos basically ruling and taking them as captives. It's one of the reasons how we know the ancient Egyptians was black, because they depicted themselves as black prisoners in certain instances in the hieroglyphs and the depictions and the reliefs. So that's what it is. So them in Genesis is giving you that establishment that history of them being in Kemet. So what we take from Genesis, which we don't really have to get too deep into, is they're giving us the science of the understanding of how we came into existence when you break it down. The fact that they're giving it to you in that whole instance as far as our masculine and feminine energy becoming into this reality, into this physical world as just us being split, or for us men, our feminine energy locked away in our subconscious, and we are masculine. It's giving you the dual energy, the creation of us right there. And there's so many different things that a lot of people are not seeing when we get into Genesis. Genesis 9:3, every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you. Even as the green herb have I given you all things, but fish with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye not eat, but flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye not eat. And this is where people get confused because they don't understand. It says, every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you. Plain and simple. But then it says in 4, but flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye not eat. Sounds like a contradiction, right? Until you go to 5 and it says, and surely your blood of your lives will I require, at the hand of every beast will I require it, and at the hand of man, at the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he man. In Genesis 9:4, but flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, shall ye not eat. It just told you in 3, every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you. But it's saying, of course, don't eat people. Don't eat people. And it reiterates that in the Bible, which we'll get into. So it's a contradiction. It's one of those things that they use to confuse people. It's telling you can eat meat. Clearly it's saying that. But then it's saying don't eat people, which we are meat, we are flesh. Of course, as it's saying, if you kill a man, which God made man is saying, then, it's going to require your life. Basically a metaphor. So a lot of people get into that. And that's one of the reasons, again, why they know. And it's one of the reasons why they put it in Genesis, because they know that the relief is there in Kemet of them preparing meat and them having that whole. It's on a relief too about them not eating man. The same thing is there. When I took that picture next to that relief in Kemet was to show you guys that it say the exact same thing. I didn't get the whole relief. I think I did, but I don't remember if I showed you guys. But it's saying in the relief that 1, this is how you prepare meat, but not to eat human meat. Of course, that's just something that they knew. But the Bible is reiterating it. The Bible is talking about talking about Kemet a lot. So it's fitting that they put that there. So as I was saying, what Genesis has given us is the establishment, the beginning. And then what they picked up from ancient Kemet and what they stole, and they basically sprinkling over Genesis along with Greek mythology. The first question people should ask themselves is, the Egyptians, when you start reading Genesis immediately, and I'm talking about them, seemingly have everything. How is these Jews the chosen people? Then who are these Egyptians that they seem to have everything? Pharaohs. What's a pharaoh? They're not really giving you enough information. And I didn't even talk about the pyramids. So it tells you how we look in our history today, how it seems as if everything began in Kemet. They are giving you that same analogy, that same story in the beginning of Genesis. And then as you'll see as we go on, is how they basically, these stories is fictional, people. Don't get caught up in these stories. A lot of the stuff they just stole, a lot of the stories they make up to try to reiterate or iterate rules and laws that they want to pass later on. It's a lot of just fictional stories that don't really mean nothing. It's just a bunch of bullshit. So don't really get attached too much to the stories, but you got to know when to pull stuff out and when to leave stuff alone. But the biggest thing to take away from it is the fact that they're going right into Kemet from the beginning. Plain and simple, because that's where their everything begins. Plain and simple. They had nothing before Kemet. Remember that. This is why the same people, the Greeks, that gave us the book, basically is telling us all they know. They don't know nothing before Kemet because they didn't have nothing. They was illiterate. They couldn't read. They was fucking killing themselves because they couldn't prepare the food right. Nothing. They had nothing. They was super primitive. All they know is coming from after they conquered Kemet. Plain and simple. Everything that the Egyptians taught them. That's why they starting out with the Egyptians. All the stuff that's happening all over the rest of the world, we get a story. that's supposedly dealing with our entire existence from this little teeny part of the world. And you would think God Almighty, who created this entire earth, should be people everywhere. It's talked about people being scattered over the planet and everything like that. What's going on in these other countries, these other cities, these other towns that we got to focus so much on this one area? But it just so happened that the same geographical location just happened to be the same location dealing with the people of the book. The Romans, the Egyptians, the Arabs, the goddamn Greeks. It's just common sense. And people just still in awe of the book and not putting that together. The fact that, one, everything is dealing with this area. Plain and simple. When you read it, first of all, who could give you any of that information about Kemet anyway in the first place? The only people that can give it to you is us Africans, one, but we know it wasn't us, or the Greeks, the way they putting it. So again, it's them establishing themselves immediately in Genesis. And then when you end off in Genesis, which you have Joseph dying, and basically, we're going into Exodus, which will, of course, give us the whole fictional story of Moses that they stole from Greek mythology. And, there it is. Plain and simple. So, that story, stole from Kemet, I should say, is more towards the Kemet area. But those stories, all the stories, through Galen and Pharaoh, with Noah's Ark and all that stuff like that, we see a mix of them basically taken from Greek mythology and from Egyptian mythology to give us these stories to implement certain, ideologies, certain things that they want to impress on us later. But with Genesis, it's just the starting place, and you can see exactly where they're trying to lead us. But the simple fact, and that's what really kills it when I start really digging into Genesis, was all the interaction with the Egyptians that you find absolutely no proof of. That was what I looked for the most when I first went to Kemet. Was, okay, where? It got to be somewhere where we can prove this interaction with these Hebrews. So imagine my surprise when I put it all together and I seen that, well, wait a minute, the Greeks created Hebrews. And then you got Dr. Joseph Yehuda giving us the book, Hebrew is Greek. It's boom, it all comes together right there. So you can see clearly this interaction that they're talking about with these so-called Hebrews. They created the Hebrews. They are the Hebrews. It's the Greek interaction that they have with the Egyptians. Plain and simple, easy. Everything else from the beginning of Genesis, giving us the creation story, giving us the creation of ourselves, establishing is so much metaphysics still in there with Genesis 32:30, Jacob and the whole pineal. Remember, even with that whole thing was weird because you have with the Jacob story, it's kind of crazy that I missed that one. You have Jacob, he's sitting there, he's worried about his brother coming with 400 men coming to kill him and everybody. He's worried about that. But then all of a sudden you got this whole, them preparing for that and them, dividing the men up and everything, all this stuff going on. The Bible good for this, as you'll see. And I pointed this out already. All this stuff going on that all of a sudden you had this one side story where basically Jacob is wrestling with God or with the angel. And then, the angel say, hey, what is your name? Well, my name is Jacob. Your name is not Jacob no more. Your name is Israel. What is that about? And then for the, after that, okay, my name is Israel now. After that, they still call him Jacob. So it was like, what was the point? So you remember when you had these name changes, when Abraham was changed to Abraham, that name stuck. They didn't call him Abraham no more. They called him Abraham. You had also when was it Sarah was changed to Sarah. Same thing. It wasn't changed again. It was calling her Sarah. So with Jacob, when his name was changed to Israel, still was calling him Jacob. And then it's not until you get later on when Joseph comes, when the Bible starts periodically calling him Israel. That's one of the things people get confused. Genesis chapter 48, let's just go down here to 2. And it says, and one told Jacob and said, behold, thy son Joseph cometh unto thee. And Israel strengthened himself and sat upon the bed. And Jacob said unto Joseph, God Almighty appeared unto me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. Even here in verse 8 it's saying, and Israel beheld Joseph's sons and said, who are these? And Joseph said unto his father. So we know Israel is talking about Jacob, They are my sons, whom God hath given me in this place. And he said, bring them, I pray thee, unto me, and I will bless them. Now the eyes of Israel were them for age. Then if you switch over here to chapter 49, it's saying, and Jacob called unto his sons and said, gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. Now it's weird, right? Because Abraham and Sarah, once their names was changed, they never again call them the former names. But with Jacob, it goes back and forth. When I researched that and was looking at, it's so many Bible scholars that talk about this. None of them can give you a definitive explanation of what that whole thing is about. Plain and simple. And to me, I think it's them really wanting to establish that name Israel as much as possible to try to get it out there early, to try to have it some kind of context with Egypt somehow, some way. So that then, when we got the whole Merneptah Stele right here, when we got this whole Stele, and it supposedly had Israel in there, so they could try to establish the fact that the Egyptians knew about the people of Israel or knew the name Israel and somehow put it in that Stele, which has already been proven to be tampered with, and them to basically make that look like Israel when it's not. It's fake, it's bullshit. But it's just one of those weird things. And Genesis is just, the stories is replete with so much stuff. And I don't want to get into all of it because it's not the most important part. And a lot of this stuff is going to make more sense as we go on. And we'll go back and, jump into Genesis, as I said, to kind of sort of make a lot of this stuff fit and work. It's going to be the same way as we go on. We'll go back and backtrack some of the verses to make the point. But it's easy to see, So the beginning of the Bible, the Genesis part, is the best book to basically debunk the entire thing as far as being, not real. So just Genesis alone, going through it, you can break it down more and see what they was really talking about and where this stuff really fits and how they set in the stage for everything else. Plain and simple. Like I said, it's pointing you to Kemet. Talked about in that game, the Bible Christianity Finally Explained. It's all pointing you back to Kemet, and it's early in the Bible where they pointing you to Kemet. And just anybody who knows that history knows that we can't go there and find anything that really traces this whole Abrahamic faith, in any kind of way with the Egyptians. So all of it is really put there to really just establish this faulty history for the Hebrews and to really try to make them fit somehow with Kemet. Because remember, it's all about them establishing that history to try to make the Exodus story fit, to give them some kind of relationship before Exodus, to make it fit, to give validity to the Jews. So as I said with the book of Enoch, if the book of Enoch is giving you something that's supposed to be true, then again, it's one of the ways you can look at it and say, because we don't know if they're trying to just establish themselves as, the whole race after Noah being all white. Then you have to ask yourself, well, where did the black people go? If everybody on the earth was wiped out and killed, and we know Noah, as it's talking about in the book of Enoch, was supposed to have been white, a different nature of his parents who clearly had to be black, then what's going on? How is his nature different? What is they talking about? And then, once he had kids, did he give birth to black kids and white kids? What's going on? So it's a lot that is tied up in that we're going to get into, because that's a deep one right there as far as the book of Enoch, which of course they left out of the King James Version because it just don't fit. So we still got to touch on that and get into that, which we will. It's crazy, but it's a lot. There's a lot to it. You can't really just, you got to read the Bible. You still can read through it. But again, as I said, remember, this is just the key point. When you read through it, don't read it as if it's a story. The next verse is supposed to be next, and it's supposed to go in some kind of order. Don't think of it like that. Just read it. Take notes. Just read through it, because a lot of stuff that makes sense for Genesis is found like 3-4 books later, as you'll see. So with the Bible original name being Helios Bibliothek, which is Greek for basically Book of the Sun, with Gene, Isis, Genesis, the names. That's another thing that just gives it all away. The names themselves, where do they come from? Greeks, Egyptian, Greek, Ethiopian, Greek. all these names and terms that's put into the King James Version that we find in the biblical sense as far as how they worded this stuff, it's Greek. Plain and simple. And they actually kept the Greek words, which is crazy to me. So it's telling you right there. So, it's big. It's deep for a lot of people to understand. And as we go on, you're going to see how it latches on with Freemasonry, everything else. Trust me, it's deep. And it's a lot to it. But, I highly recommend people going through and reading the book. I mean, after the series, you don't really have to. I mean, a lot of the stuff is really just stories. It's bullshit. It's kind of sort of a waste of time in some instances, but it's still good to do and take notes on so you just know for yourself. But we're going to go through it, and we're going to, you know how I do it. It's going to make sense. It's going to be crazy. So, wanted to get Genesis out the way. First book of the Bible. Not too much to really harp on, but we're still going to go back. We're going to get into Exodus next and really start breaking this whole thing down as far as, the whole story with the Jews, because it's deep and it's crazy. It's a lot to get into that we just got to understand to put out there. Got to get put out there. So, I want to thank you guys for taking the time to watch and support, purchase. And we got a long way to go with this series. It's going to be DVDs that I put out in between that's going to help, this make more sense in certain ways, but not really. I'm going to try to keep everything in this biblical series. As a matter of fact, I will. That way nobody get confused. But it's a lot, it's a lot. And I don't want to give too much away in newer videos for what we're going to be seeing in this series. So definitely keep up with it. It's going to be good. It's going to take us a while to get through it, but it's going to be worth it. And thank you guys for taking the time to watch and purchase and support. And see you next video.